Terrorize my family? Enjoy losing everything and going back to jail, by user RatedSfan 9000. Wife. Douchebag. Entitled Woman. Entitled Woman 2. Hello, this is a long post, so buckle up for the ride. Myself and my wife had just had our second child and moved into a duplex in an amazing neighborhood, had its own playground even. We moved in and greeted the neighbors, bunch of younger people, but they seemed okay. The first day after moving in we find that they're gone and they're left their 7-year-old, on a school day, outside our door with a bag of goldfish and a note asking us to watch him while they went out. QCPS call number 1. The neighbors and me got along really well. Old guy next door repaired bikes for a hobby, and the next door neighbor did woodworking and would always come over to see the kids and sent his grandkids over to play too. They warned us that our upstairs neighbors were trouble, constant traffic going in and out and parties every single night. This was 110% the truth. It got to the point we couldn't sleep at night and we had multiple altercations to the point it was full-blown yelling matches. The landlord was useless and would do nothing to get rid of them, so I bided my time. Eventually one night they came home in their red Mazda 3 and it was destroyed. They must have hit someone and ran, so I called the RCMP to let them know, as at the very least I figured they'd get in deep shit, but oh man, I had no idea what I had just unleashed. Turns out the douchebag had a warrant out for his arrest for drug trafficking. He got hauled away in cuffs that night and Entitled Woman 2 got a visit from CPS again as they left their son home alone again. This wasn't once or twice, it was every single day. So my wife went digging for names and found the mother on Facebook. Using public record searches we found out that they owed Easy Home nearly $48,000 in assets, as they had taken off from the original address with all of their furniture including TVs and a huge sound system. 48 hours later the sheriff was there with a box truck emptying their house. Took the beds, couches, TVs, the annoying subwoofer system, kitchen set and even the dressers. CPS came shortly after and removed the child from the house. I didn't enjoy seeing him taken away, but they never fed him and he was always in the same clothing and it was falling apart. We went out of our way to make sure he had full meals when we could not gonna let a kid starve. The douchebag went to jail for drug possession. He was out on bail and hid the drugs in a dresser they took. Entitled Woman 1 went to jail for assaulting the sheriff, and Entitled Woman 2 actually had a happy ending. Far as I know, after she lost her son she went through multiple programs to clean herself up and started working to provide for her son. Ran into her a couple years ago and she thanked me for what I did. I got ProRevenge on the drug dealer and his girlfriend and thankfully helped someone get on the right path. Pick on my nephew? We'll see about that. By user Don't Tread on Me, I'm a duck. I was going to post this in malicious compliance, but then my cousin pointed out this probably belongs here because of how things ended. Let me know if it belongs somewhere else, and I will gladly post it. I would also like to apologize that it's so long. Apparently, I like to write. This story takes place a few years ago when my nephew was still a toddler, but I was thinking about it recently and thought some of the people of the internet might be entertained by this story. Just to avoid confusion, my nephew is my cousin's son. My cousin and I were raised basically as sisters and have done everything together since we were young, so her children call me their aunt and my children will call her their aunt. When my nephew was a toddler, my cousin put him in daycare so that she could work. She had been leaving him with my uncle until he was 18 months old, but this was when my uncle was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and he was just too sick to take care of my nephew anymore. One day when we were talking, my cousin mentioned how money was getting tight because almost all her extra money was going to the daycare, which my nephew was at from 8:30 in the morning until 12:30 in the afternoon. I asked her what she did between 12:30 and 5:30, and she admitted she was having to only take half shifts because she didn't have anyone to watch my nephew. She had asked the hospice agency that was assigned to help her dad if they could help with that 5-hour window, but she got, in my opinion, a rather rude response that they were there to help her dad and not her with childcare. I would also like to point out that my cousin was a single mother trying to work and care for her dying father. The hospice agency came through for us in some big ways later, so this was nothing more than a hiccup. Well, I was raised that it takes a village, so I suggested that she keep him in the daycare from 8:30 to 12:30, and that I would pick him up from daycare at 12:30 and watch him until her shift ended. I could do my college coursework in the morning, I was in an online program, and then be with my nephew for the afternoon. The hospice agency was taking care of her dad during this time frame, so unless someone was needed to make medical decisions, he was mostly taken care of. We never discussed payment or anything like that because I knew money was tight, and just wanted to help my cousin out. She was ecstatic since she could now take full shifts and both her son and her dad would be taken care of. Things went great for about 6 months. She would drop my nephew off at daycare at 8:30, then I would pick him up at 12:30, then she would pick him up from me at 5:30. Around the 6-month mark, the daycare went through a serious staff overhaul. About half of the staff was fired or let go and replaced with highly qualified staff, most of whom were barely out of college and many of whom were still in college. The staff they let go were those that were older or close to retirement. Suddenly, I was getting calls to come pick my nephew up now, because they just couldn't handle him. Mind you, there had been almost no problems in the 6 months prior to the staff overhaul. They didn't call me, first, either. The daycare would call my cousin, demanding she leave work and come get him that minute. Then she would call me, having no idea what was going on, and I would go pick him up. They would usually call her around 11 o'clock. When I would get there to pick him up, my nephew was always confused about what was going on, very calm, and they hadn't fed him. Part of the price for the daycare was that they were supposed to feed him lunch before I got there to get him. After about a week of this, my cousin got tired of being called at work. She blew up at the director of the daycare, who claimed she had no knowledge that my nephew was being picked up early. My cousin demanded a full refund for the week without lunches, since they hadn't fed him. I had, and demanded that they start calling me directly rather than her, since they knew I was the one who was going to be picking him up. She told the director she felt like they were trying to get her fired from her job, which was counterintuitive to them making any money, and blatantly biased against a single mother. Maybe my cousin didn't handle that conversation the best, but I still don't blame her one bit. Something was going on, we just didn't quite know what. The director agreed to reimburse my cousin for the week worth of meals, but then went on about how they had multiple complaints from parents about my nephew and she thought it would be best if I started picking him up at 11 o'clock, instead of 12:30. My cousin demanded to know what complaints, since she hadn't been told about any, and we hadn't had any issues in the prior 6 months, but the director started claiming privacy of her clients and refused to actually answer. The reimbursement for meals for the week was $50, and her total reduction in monthly cost, since I had to pick my nephew up early, was $150. My cousin was still paying this daycare just over $600 a month. I felt like their math was way off, but my cousin didn't want to fight it, so I agreed to start picking my nephew up at 11 o'clock, and I would feed him lunch. The daycare also never told us what my nephew was doing that they just couldn't handle. This new plan went fine for about 2 weeks. Then I started getting calls at, I kid you not, 10:50 to come pick him up now. Every time I would have my keys in my hand and 1 foot out the door when they were calling. The daycare was only about a 5-minute drive from my house, and I usually was there by 10:58 to get my nephew. The first couple of times it happened, I just told the woman calling that I was supposed to pick him up at 11 o'clock, and she could just learn to wait 10 minutes. She was still taking our money, after all. The third or fourth time it happened, it was the director calling me, accusing me of deliberately being late when I knew I had a problem child. I demanded to know what the exact problem was, and she once again mentioned complaints from other parents, but refused to go into any further detail. I accused her of simply not liking my nephew, but she sure seemed to like my cousin's money. She said if we didn't get a handle on things, she would call my nephew's grandpa. I reminded her that my uncle had stage 4 pancreatic cancer and was on hospice, and any phone call of that type would be blatant disregard for the situation, and there wasn't anything he could do, anyway. I had never been late to pick my nephew up before, contrary to her accusation, but I was about 20 minutes late picking him up that day. Now I wish I hadn't, but thankfully, my nephew was fine. When I got there to get him, they had him sitting outside, by himself. No one was with him, the door was locked, and I didn't see anyone looking out the window. At this point, my nephew was 26 months old, just over 2 years. I was livid, and that's not even the end of it. I picked him up, put him in my car, waiting for someone to come out and say something, confirm I was the one supposed to be picking him up, or anything. Nothing like that happened. I waited in the car about 5 minutes before taking off. When I got to my house, I called my cousin to let her know what happened. Turns out, the director actually did call my uncle after she talked to me. He then called my cousin and was in a panic because the director was claiming my nephew had harmed other children, there were complaints from parents, and my cousin and I were refusing to handle it. The director hadn't told my cousin or I any of this. I got my nephew and took him over to my cousin and uncle's house. My uncle had started to calm down and was relieved to see my nephew. I asked the hospice worker what she was thinking giving my uncle the phone. The hospice worker was so upset, because according to her the director made it sound like there was some kind of medical emergency and she couldn't get hold of my cousin or I and was calling my uncle as a last resort. She swore she absolutely would not have given him the phone, otherwise, and she felt violated and lied to by the director of the daycare. The hospice worker had even put in a call to her supervisor. She was so upset about it and didn't really know how to handle the situation other than to calm my uncle down. Sorry for the long backstory, but this is where the nuclear revenge comes in. My cousin left work early and came in about half an hour after all of this had occurred. The hospice worker had just gotten a call back from her supervisor, and she had put her supervisor on speaker so that my uncle and I could hear what was being said. If I remember right, my nephew was watching a movie and paying very little attention to what any of the adults were doing. The hospice supervisor was just as upset as we were because she had a son about the same age as my nephew, who went to daycare every day. She was also upset because the daycare involved my uncle unnecessarily and had upset him the way they did. Her first recommendation was to call the police and make a report of child abandonment since I had found my nephew outside and the door was locked. She then recommended a report to social services about the behavior of the daycare over the past month, since she knew for a fact they were getting state and federal grants. She herself was going to make a report to the insurance board because they contacted my uncle after clearly getting hold of a preferred contact and my uncle was supposed to be an absolute last resort contact. My cousin had listed him as a contact when she first put my nephew in the daycare but had updated the paperwork multiple times where she did not list my uncle's contact information at all. I got on the phone with the police while my cousin got on the phone with social services. The dispatcher taking down the police report commented that it would just be a he said she said situation, since he already knew the daycare would deny the allegation. I happened to have a dashcam and had activated it when I saw my nephew sitting by himself. This was back when the footage was so grainy you could barely see anything, but the audio was decent and you could hear my exclamation of surprise when I flipped it on, then when I was picking my nephew up and putting him in the car, then about 3 minutes of me sitting in the car waiting for someone to come out before the dashcam died. This was back in the days where the batteries were lucky to last you more than 10 minutes. Obviously, the police department wanted a copy of that footage, as grainy as it was, for corroboration of the report, which I was happy to provide. My cousin got transferred a few times until she got to the right county department to take her complaint and found out she was one of several complaints being made against the daycare. They also recommended contacting the police about finding my nephew alone, which I was already doing. Social services told my cousin they had already started an investigation and would add her complaint to the growing pile. My cousin took a couple days off work to spend time with her dad and son. During that time, she asked my nephew if he wanted to go back to daycare, and he said no. When she asked him why, he kept saying they were mean. He didn't say much beyond that, which made sense, but keep in mind that he was just 2. I was about 2 weeks from going on summer break from college and told my cousin not to worry about daycare for the summer, that I could take my nephew for full days during the summer, and it would give her a little time to find a daycare alternative. After my nephew's few comments about the daycare, and knowing what they were pulling on the adults, we weren't making him go back there for any reason. One of my cousin's co-workers later told us how to get on a county program that paid me $700 a month to watch my nephew, and my cousin wouldn't have to cover daycare cost, at all. We were able to do this until my nephew started kindergarten 2 years later. It put money in my pocket while I finished getting my bachelor's degree, and my cousin had a little extra to put towards bills and normal living expenses. The county, the police department, and the state insurance board each did an investigation on the daycare. They were shut down about a month after the incidents with my nephew due to multiple complaints of egregious acts against a child. I'm not entirely sure I want to know what that means, but I can certainly guess based on my family's experience. I'm not sure if any criminal charges were brought against the daycare or the director of the daycare, but the DA did contact both my cousin and me within a week of the daycare closing. The DA had wanted to speak to my uncle, as well, but my uncle passed away about a month after the daycare was formally shut down, and he was too sick to do an interview when the DA was asking for one. The building sat empty for about 2 months before another group took it over and put in another daycare. While there have been no complaints that I've heard against the new daycare, I'm not putting my children there and my cousin didn't put her next 2 children there. We'll stick with family, from now on.